He came with a gang to rob and destroy. But days later, he returned to the same place and stood next to the family he had left with nothing. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the hard ground, painting the land in hues of amber and rust. Dust swirled in restless spirals, carried by the wind that whispered endlessly across the open plains. The West had always been cruel, a place where survival belonged not to the righteous, but to the ruthless, where the law of the gun weighed heavier than the words of any judge. Out here, towns were scattered like lonely islands, connected by trails marked more often by bones than by milestones. It was in this harsh wilderness that Jackson Colt had carved out his life, though lately he wondered if it was life at all. Jackson rode with the men known as the Wolf Pack, a band of outlaws whose very name made farmers bar their doors at night, and mothers clutch their children when the sound of hooves drew near. The pack lived by theft, by sudden raids on lonely homesteads, by the fear they spread wherever they passed. They were wolves indeed, and Jackson had long ago accepted himself as one of them. His coat was a dust-worn duster, his boots cracked from years in the saddle, and his revolver bore the scars of too many fights. Yet beneath the hard surface, his eyes betrayed something he kept hidden from the others: exhaustion, the weight of too many nights haunted by the cries of the robbed and the dying. Roy Dalton, their leader, thrived on cruelty. He was a broad man with a scar across his cheek, and he ruled with the kind of fear that made men obey even when their stomachs twisted against it. Jackson had followed Roy for years, through blood and fire, across rivers of dust and valleys of death. Once, when he had nothing left but a horse and rage, the band had seemed like family. Now they were little more than a chain around his neck, dragging him deeper into a pit he no longer wanted to fall into. That evening, when the sun sank low and the pack caught sight of smoke curling from the chimney of a modest dwelling tucked against the slope of a barren hill, Roy's eyes glinted with hunger. "We'll pay them a visit," he said, and his voice was the kind that brooked no argument. Jackson tightened his reins, a sick feeling gnawing his gut, though he said nothing. Obedience was survival. The house was humble, more a shelter against the wind than a home. Its walls were patched with clay and straw, its roof held together by logs that leaned with age. Around it lay a small garden, some goats tethered to posts, and the air of a family who clung to survival with desperate hands. Jackson recognized the signs. They were people driven out, left with nothing but each other and what little they could build on unforgiving land. He had seen such lives before. The wolf pack descended like shadows. Guns gleamed in the fading light, and the cries of alarm rose quickly. A man, gray with years, but still strong in spirit, stepped in front of his family, raising a tool in defiance. He did not last long. A strike from a rifle's butt sent him sprawling into the dust. Women screamed. Children hid behind the skirts of their mother. The goats scattered, the garden trampled under boots. Jackson moved with the others, but his heart felt heavier with every step. Then he saw her. She stood in the doorway, tall and unbending, her black hair loose around her shoulders, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that startled him. She did not cower, though the gun barrels gleamed before her. She did not beg, though the laughter of the bandits filled the air. She met them with a gaze of pure defiance, her lips pressed tight, her jaw set in pride. In that moment, Jackson felt something shift inside him. It was not fear nor admiration, but a piercing realization that he was looking at a mirror of what he had once been. Unbroken, unyielding, still human. Roy barked orders, and the men ransacked the place. They took blankets, grain, trinkets from a chest by the wall. From the women they stripped jewelry, From the yard, they drove the goats. Jackson stuffed his saddlebags with stolen grain, his hands moving by habit, while his eyes kept straying back to the girl. She stared at him as though she could see through every layer of filth and sin he had gathered in his years of crime, as though she were silently pronouncing judgment. For the first time in many years, Jackson felt shame burn through him like whiskey in an empty stomach. The band left the family in ruin. Dust rose in their wake, carrying the sound of laughter and the clinking of stolen goods. The father lay groaning. The mother wept quietly as she tried to gather the children, and the girl remained standing, her fists clenched, her eyes following the retreating riders. Jackson did not look back, though every muscle in his body wanted to. Back at camp, the men celebrated their raid. Firelight danced across their faces as they drank and divided the spoils. Roy boasted of their strength, mocked the helplessness of their victims, and promised richer hauls down the trail. Jackson sat apart, chewing at a piece of jerky that tasted like ash in his mouth. He could not shake the image of the girl's eyes, nor the sound of her silence amid the chaos. He thought of the father crumpling to the ground, of the children's terror, of the goats scattering into the wilderness. The night stretched long, filled with drunken laughter and the smell of smoke. Jackson lay awake on his bedroll, staring at the stars. Once, the night sky had meant freedom to him, a vast promise that no one could chain. Now it felt like an endless witness to his sins. His hand touched the revolver at his side, and he wondered if he had become nothing more than the weapon he carried. When dawn came, Jackson mounted his horse before the others stirred. He rode out, not toward the horizon of new raids, but back toward the place they had torn apart. His heart pounded with every hoofbeat, for he had no plan, only a gnawing need he could not name. He crested the hill where the small home stood, and his breath caught. The roof sagged where the men had broken it. The garden was scattered, the yard empty of goats. Smoke rose faintly from the hearth inside, but it was not the clean smoke of cooking fires. It was the acrid haze of smoldering ruin. And there they were. The family, bent over the wreckage, trying with bleeding hands to rebuild what had been broken. The old man struggled to lift a fallen beam. The mother tied scraps of cloth around wounds. The children carried stones in silence. The girl stood apart, her eyes scanning the horizon, as though daring the world to bring more ruin. Jackson did not ride closer. He watched from the distance, shame pressing on him like the weight of the earth itself. He thought of the saddlebags slung behind him, heavy with stolen grain. His throat tightened. He wanted to dismount, to walk forward, to place the food back in their hands, and beg forgiveness. But he remained frozen, torn between the chains of the pack and the first stirrings of something he had not felt in years, the urge to do right. As the sun climbed higher, Jackson turned his horse away, but in his chest, a fire had been lit. The image of the family, struggling against ruin, would not leave him, nor would the girl's eyes, dark with fury and dignity. He rode back toward camp, but each step of his horse felt like betrayal of something greater than himself. That night, when the wolf pack feasted again, and Roy boasted of future plunder, Jackson sat apart in silence. He chewed at nothing, his hands clenched into fists, his mind already drifting back to that ruined home. He knew he would return. He knew he could not stay the man he had become, and though he did not yet know how, he sensed that his path had already split away from the wolves. The night after the raid had been restless, haunted by images that Jackson Colt could not drive from his mind. Around him, the wolf pack had sunk into drunken sleep, their laughter fading to guttural snores, but his eyes refused to close. He lay awake, staring into the dark sky, tracing the constellations, with the hollow feeling of a man who had forgotten what stars meant. His mind returned again and again to the image of that family left in ruin, the father's body in the dust, the children's frightened faces, and above all, the girl who had stood against them like a flame, refusing to be snuffed out. He had thought that years of blood and plunder had hardened him beyond such torment. Yet here he was, unable to rest, while the memory burned at him. When dawn broke, he saddled his horse in silence, ignoring the questioning look from one of the younger outlaws who stirred as he mounted. Jackson muttered something about scouting the trail and rode out before the man could probe further. His horse's hooves struck the ground with steady rhythm, each beat echoing his turmoil. The land stretched wide and empty, the horizon blurred with heat. And in that expanse, he found himself riding not toward a town or a new score, but back toward the hills, where ruin lay smoldering. As he crested the ridge, the sight before him carved deeper into his conscience. The family had not fled. They were still there, bent over the wreckage of what had once been their fragile home. The father struggled with a broken beam, his body hunched, but unwilling to yield to pain. The mother moved among the children, her hands torn as she tied scraps of cloth into makeshift bandages. The small figures of the little ones carried stones in silence, their faces set in grim determination far too old for their years. And the girl, always the girl, stood at the edge of the broken yard, eyes scanning the horizon as if daring fate itself to test them again. Jackson remained on his horse for a long moment, wrestling with himself. In his saddlebags lay food and cloth he had snatched from the raid, prizes that weighed heavier than lead. He knew if he returned them, it would be more than a gesture. It would be betrayal of the pack and of everything he had lived by for years. Yet watching that family claw survival from the dust, he found he could no longer cling to silence. He urged his horse forward. The approach was noticed quickly. The children froze. The father reached for a tool as if it were a weapon, and the girl's eyes narrowed in fiery recognition. Jackson dismounted slowly, hands held away from his gun, each step deliberate. When he placed the sacks of grain and folded blankets on the ground before them, the silence thickened until it felt like a storm ready to break. The father's voice rasped, demanding to know his purpose. Jackson, his throat dry, managed only to say that these things did not belong to him and never had. The girl's eyes blazed with contempt. Her voice sharp and cutting as she asked if this was meant to undo what he had done, if he thought a handful of food could erase their suffering. Jackson did not answer. He simply bowed his head, shoulders heavy, and said he had no right to ask anything of them. It was the mother who broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, lined with weariness. But in her words, there was a strange mercy. She said that a man who steals and returns is not the same man who left, and that sometimes even a wolf can change its path if he dares to step away from the pack. The daughter scoffed, yet she did not stop him when he picked up a fallen beam and helped raise it into place against the ruined roof. So began the days that followed. Jackson returned again and again, sometimes under cover of night, sometimes in the pale light of morning. At first he brought more of the things he had hidden away, tools, cloth, even a goat he managed to wrest from the hands of one of his unsuspecting comrades. Then he came empty-handed, offering instead the strength of his arms. He worked beside them, hauling timber, stacking stones, patching walls with mud and straw. He did not speak often, but the weight of his silence carried more than words could. The girl, whose name he learned was Aya, remained distant, her eyes cold as steel. She watched him as one might watch a rattlesnake waiting for the strike. When she spoke, it was with scorn, reminding him of the ruin his kind had caused. Yet even as she resisted, her hand sometimes worked beside his, lifting beams or holding ladders, and in those moments their silence mingled not in hatred, but in fragile, unspoken acknowledgement. Jackson began to tell pieces of his story, not all at once, but in fragments scattered like broken glass. He told them of the fire that had taken his family, of the desperation that had led him to Roy Dalton's band, of the years of blood that had followed. His words came haltingly, as if each one was dragged from a place he had long buried. Aya listened with crossed arms, suspicion etched into her every line. But there were moments when her eyes softened, if only for an instant. One evening, as they sat near the smoldering remains of a cooking fire, Aya spoke at last of her own truth. She told him they had not simply left their people out of choice, but had been driven out. Her father had opposed the council's dealings with white traders, who brought guns and liquor into the tribe, and for his defiance, they had been exiled. Alone, cut off from kin and clan, they had built this place with their own hands, only to see it torn down by raiders like him. In her words was both bitterness and pride, and Jackson felt her pain like a weight pressing against his chest. The days stretched into weeks, and the lines that had once been walls between them began to blur. Aya no longer turned her back when he approached. The children grew less fearful, even curious, sometimes daring to follow him as he fetched water or split wood. The father, though slow to trust, allowed him to share the work without constant suspicion. The mother continued to watch him with those knowing eyes, as if she saw in him the battle he fought within himself. Yet the shadow of the wolf pack loomed. Jackson's absences had not gone unnoticed. Roy Dalton was not a man to ignore disloyalty, and whispers began to stir among the outlaws. One night, as Jackson returned to camp, he found their eyes following him with suspicion. A younger member, sly and eager to rise, muttered that Jackson's saddlebag seemed lighter than before, that perhaps he was holding back his share. Jackson offered no reply, but he felt the noose tightening. Roy's questions came soon after. Why did he vanish for hours? What trail did he follow when others saw him ride toward the hills? Jackson shrugged, claiming to scout, to watch for posies or bounty hunters. Roy's eyes narrowed, not convinced. The pack thrived on trust, bound by fear, and the scent of betrayal was something they tore apart with savage delight. Back at the ruined homestead, Jackson worked harder than ever, but his mind was restless. He knew time was running out. The pack would follow him sooner or later, and when they did, they would not hesitate to kill not only him, but those he now felt bound to protect. At night, lying near the rebuilt walls of the family's home, he watched the flickering firelight dance across Aya's face. He wondered if she would ever believe that he could be more than what he had been. He wondered if redemption was anything more than a word, or if it was something a man had to carve with blood and sacrifice. In the quiet, he realized the choice was no longer his alone. The pack had marked him, and soon enough, the wolves would come to tear him down. The days that followed blurred into one another, heavy with labor and silence, yet charged with the weight of an approaching storm. Jackson Colt continued to split wood, mend fences, and carry stones alongside the family he had once helped destroy. But the unease that crept into his every step was like a shadow that would not lift. Aya no longer scorned him with every glance, though mistrust lingered in her dark eyes. Sometimes, when the wind shifted and caught her hair loose around her face, Jackson caught himself staring too long, as though trying to capture the moment of her defiance the night he had first seen her in the doorway. But even as a flicker of understanding began to spark between them, the knowledge of what lay beyond the hills pressed heavily on his conscience. The wolf pack would not be blind forever, and their leader was not a man who forgave secrets. Jackson could feel the noose tightening, The glances back in camp had grown sharper, the mutters louder. Roy Dalton, with his cruel eyes and voice like gravel, had questioned him more than once, each time letting suspicion settle deeper in the air. "Where do you ride, Colt?" he had asked, leaning close by the fire one night. "Always toward those hills. You looking for gold? Or hiding something?" Jackson had answered with the steady silence of a man used to swallowing truth, but inside he knew it was only a matter of time. Wolves always followed a wounded scent, and soon they would come hunting. One evening, as Jackson helped the father lift a beam into place, the older man collapsed under its weight. Jackson caught it before it crushed him, his muscles straining until the post stood upright again. The old man wheezed, then nodded with a look of reluctant gratitude. Aya watched from across the yard, her arms crossed, but when her eyes met Jackson's, she did not look away. That night, as the family sat around their small fire, the children chewing slowly on what little food they had, Jackson placed a bundle on the ground. Inside were trinkets bracelets, a necklace of silver beads that he had taken back from the outlaw's stash at great risk. The children gasped. The mother covered her mouth, and Aya's eyes widened in recognition. These were pieces that had belonged to them, the last remnants of their pride, torn away during the raid. "You kept them," Aya whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Jackson shook his head. "They were never mine." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the meaning of his act. For the first time, Aya's gaze softened, though it held no forgiveness yet. It was only later, when the children had gone to sleep and the firelight flickered low, that she spoke to him again. "If you return them, you return also the shame of taking them. You can never erase it." "I know," Jackson said quietly, "but maybe I can carry it instead." The days wore on, and Jackson began to notice small changes. The children laughed again, timidly at first, then more freely when he lifted them onto his horse or taught them how to throw a stone true at a post. The mother hummed softly as she worked. The old man sat straighter, as though strength had crept back into his bones. And Aya, though guarded, began to walk beside him in the fields, sometimes handing him tools without words, sometimes lingering in silence longer than necessary. There was no easy trust, but there was something else growing between them, a fragile thread spun from shared labor and unspoken understanding. But the storm he feared finally broke. It came one moonless night. Jackson had been mending a fence at the edge of the property when he heard the distant thunder of hooves. The sound chilled him instantly. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw the glow of torches approaching across the barren land. The wolf pack had come. He knew without doubt why they were here. They would not only drag him back, but they would slaughter the family he had chosen to stand with, simply to prove the cost of betrayal. Jackson ran back to the homestead, shouting for them to wake. Aya appeared in the doorway, alarm flashing in her eyes as she heard the growing thunder. The old man tried to gather the children, while the mother fumbled for what little they could carry. Jackson drew his revolver, checking the chambers by instinct, his jaw tightening. "They're coming for me," he said, voice steady despite the fire racing in his veins. "But they'll kill you too if I don't stop them." The father placed a hand on his shoulder. The first time he had touched him without suspicion. "Then you must not stand alone." Moments later, the wolf pack arrived. Roy Dalton rode at the front, his scarred face twisted with rage at the sight of his former comrade standing before the family's broken home. He raised his rifle, his voice booming in the night. "So it's true. You've turned your back on your own. You chose dirt farmers and outcasts over your brothers. You're no wolf, Colt. You're carrion." Jackson stepped forward, revolver drawn, his body a shield between the outlaws and the family behind him. His voice rang clear through the darkness. Maybe I was a wolf once, but I'm done tearing apart the weak. If you want blood tonight, it's mine you'll take." A tense silence followed, broken only by the restless snort of horses and the hiss of the wind through the grass. Then Roy sneered, spat into the dirt, and gave the order. The pack surged forward. The battle was chaos. Gunfire cracked through the night, the thunder of hooves mingling with shouts and screams. Jackson fired with deadly precision, his revolver barking flame as one rider fell, then another. Bullets tore through the walls of the homestead, splintering wood, sending sparks flying. Aya's brother loosed arrows from an old bow, his aim crude but desperate, while the children hurled stones from the shadows. Aya herself seized a torch, setting fire to a barrier of brush Jackson had piled earlier, creating a wall of smoke and flame that slowed the attackers. But the pack pressed hard, their numbers greater, their fury unrelenting. Jackson fought with the strength of a man who knew this was his final stand. He moved with grim determination, each shot a vow, each strike a confession. Pain seared through him as a bullet grazed his arm, then another tore into his side, but he did not falter. He heard Aya cry out as a bandit lunged toward her, and he cut the man down with a single furious shot. Blood filled the dust, fire lit the night, and the homestead became a battleground between past and future. At last, the tide shifted. Several of the pack lay dead or wounded, their cries filling the night air. The rest, seeing their leader falter, began to retreat into the darkness, their courage broken. Roy Dalton himself, wounded in the leg, glared at Jackson with venom before spurring his horse and vanishing into the hills. Silence fell heavy after the storm, broken only by the crackle of fire and the groans of the dying. Jackson staggered, blood staining his shirt, his revolver slipping from his grasp. Aya rushed to his side, catching him as he fell to one knee. Her hands pressed against his wound, her eyes filled with something he had not seen before. Not scorn, not contempt, but fear of losing him. "You'll die if you don't stop," she whispered fiercely. He forced a pained smile. "Then at least I'll die as something more than what I was." The family worked through the night to tend his wounds, binding his side, cooling his fever with wet cloth. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by memories of the raid, by faces he could never erase. Yet each time he woke, he saw Aya's face near his, watching with an intensity that spoke of more than hatred now. By dawn, the danger had passed. The homestead still stood, scarred but unbroken. The family moved among the ruins, gathering what they could, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had survived the wolves. Jackson, pale and weak, rose with effort, his hand resting on Aya's arm for balance. From his saddlebag, which had somehow survived the chaos, he drew the last of the trinkets, the final remnant stolen during that night of ruin weeks ago. With trembling hands, he placed them in Aya's palms. "This is all I took," he said. "It belongs with you." She closed her fingers around them, her eyes glistening. For a long moment she said nothing. Then at last, her voice soft, she answered. "You can't undo the past, Jackson. But maybe you can help build what comes after." He nodded, the weight of her words settling into him like a promise. For the first time in years, he felt the burden of his sins lessen, replaced not with forgiveness, but with purpose. As the sun rose over the battered homestead, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Jackson stood among them, not as a wolf, not as an outlaw, but as a man who had chosen a different road. The family gathered around him, and though scars remained, there was a sense of something new in the air. Survival, perhaps even hope. And as the day stretched wide before them, Jackson Colt knew he would never again ride with the pack. He had found a place to stand, and though it would demand sweat toil and sacrifice. It was a road he was willing to walk. One step at a time, beside those who had taught him what it meant to be human again. If this story spoke to you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now, and explore the others already on the channel. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.